Good morning. Today I'm going to be talking about how to integrate an API call into a Polyapp task. This is one of the more complicated things you could possibly want to do with Polyapp, and so I think it's deserving of a video. In order to understand how we're going to be integrating API calls, first you need to understand how to create a task. I'm not going to be covering that in this tutorial, and instead I'm going to use this already created task to illustrate how to integrate this API. So this task has 4 fields. Field not affected, this counter field, this word to translate field, and this trigger field, which was chosen as a button for the UI. So the thing you want to do after you have created your task is to create this API call task. So in this case, I'm not going to show myself creating any of these things because you don't want to see me type. So in this case, you're going to open up a new API called data, and you're going to want to come down here after naming it to configure API call. You're going to want to set up your request URL, maybe your request body, set any of these other headings or other settings or set cookies. Then you're going to want to hit test. So the reason why we want to test the API call is because this is sort of a self-contained way to make sure that the API call is going to work before we've actually integrated it with our task. So you still are going to end up having to create like a test data within your task just to test that everything is working properly with your task's data. However, initially you can get away with just testing with this. So for example, I created this very simple API which prints out the received URL and the received body, and it has this response, which includes this counter and this translate, with translate being this random string, and this counter being an incrementing counter. So we can see the counter is currently at 15. For instance, if we were to hit test again, it would make another API call. There we go. And if we were to look in here, you can see the counter is now at 16 and incremented by 1. All right, so the first thing you're going to do, again, is create this task. Then the second thing we did was we opened up this API call and we configured the API call by setting up the request URL, setting up the request body, etc. And then the third thing we did was tested it. And now that we have a test response, we're going to actually integrate it into this task. So I'm going to go to the edit task page for this task. I'll show you how that is done. So the first thing you're going to want to do is scroll down to the bots area and decide where you want to integrate this API call. So in my case, I integrated it in all 3 places, both different bots, just as a demonstration point. So bots triggered at load, you can read more about when those are triggered. And in order to get the ID of the bot you want to use, you're going to want to come back to this API call, and it will have the ingress bot ID and the egress bot ID right here, easy for you to copy and paste. So as we can see, I've used both of them in each slot. So one thing to keep in mind is that this is all the configuration you need to do for at load and at done. But we don't want to continuously call external APIs every time somebody updates or every time somebody types into a field in the UI, because you just don't want to overwhelm this external API, and it puts some extra strain on Polyapp servers as well. So instead of doing that, when the bot is triggered continuously, you have to set up this extra field. So we saw here that it tells us to use this bot static data, and then I copied and pasted it into bot static data inside the task, the so-called target task, where I'm going to be making this API call. But you also need to add this trigger field. API call continuous trigger field is trigger field. If we come down here, we can see we have this trigger field, and it is a button. So basically, when this button is clicked, it triggers the API call. All right, so let's look at us actually using this. So we can see the API was called twice when the page loaded, and it should be called one more time here. I guess not. So the first time the API was called, I don't know why it's printing this out, but the first time the API was called, it was because of the first. So every time in the configuration for edit task, we were actually calling it twice. We were calling it once as the egress bot and once as the ingress bot. And so when we loaded the page, it got called twice, once from each of those locations. And it might have also been called again when it loaded because it's in bot trigger continuously, but it wasn't because the trigger field was not true. If we click this trigger field button, it will initiate 2 more requests because, oh, and then 2 more again because the page reloads. So it actually initiated 4 requests. So just to try to explain that. So when you hit the trigger field, it's going to look at all the bots trigger continuously, and it will trigger those that are listed. And we have 2 listed in bots triggered continuously. After it's triggered, it's going to open up this task again because we need to sort of refresh the page in order to get the new information that was added from this external API. And because we have the API call on both bot at load and bot triggered continuously, when the page refreshed, bot at loads ran, which triggered more API calls. And that's why we saw 4 API calls there. Okay, so when the page loaded, it updated fields like counter, which is currently at 20. And I think it should be something like 24 after it reloads here. No, it says 23. Must be a little bit off there. Oh wait, this might be because so there are these 2 different types of bots, right? 2 different ways you could be using this. One is if it's an ingress bot. So that's where, we've got data on this other server that we want to put into our tasks data. The other one is an egress bot where we have data in our task that we want to put into the other server. So the ingress bot is right here. So it's taking the response translate in the response, and it's putting it into Word to translate the Polyapp field name. So that's how this value got populated. Notice how this is the same as the translate field. And the counter field in the response exactly matches our counter field. So we didn't, even though we didn't add like an API call response mapping for counter, it still worked. And in the request body, we can see if we check out the request body that we're saying translate and dot out. And so Word to translate here, the Polyapp field name gets translated into the template variable out. And that's the only reason why the request is succeeding. If we were to delete one of these, like let's say let's delete this, we were to hit test, this API call will fail and it will show us, I believe, a 400 status code, or it will do this. All right, result of running the template counter had no value. So what this means, if you were to see this error, which you probably will, is that you need to have a counter field name available when you're making the request. Now, well, basically we need to have the counter field input into the text template, which is used for the for creating the body of the request. And as it happened, text template is also used for creating the request URL, and it just did not find this counter field. And so sometimes you'll have to add query mappings or body mappings, which go from the field name to the external field name, and they're just identical. This isn't necessary for the actual task, because in the actual task it'll pull this value, but for this test screen you do have to add this mapping from counter to itself. All right, so let's try to do a recap here, because this is kind of a lot of information. So when you want to integrate an API into Polyapp, the first thing you're going to need is a task to integrate with. That's like this target task. And that task is going to have some fields. And when you make the request, those fields can be used as template input variables for the request URL and the request body. Just to clarify, this is not necessary at all. We could just delete this and instead use, some string, and it would actually be easier to make such a request. Yep, and we can see some string was part of the request. So the reason why you want these variables is to take data from your task and put it into the external API, send it out there. In other words, to egress data from Polyapp. Or the other option you might have with an API integration is you want to ingress data. So you want to take data from this external API and you want to put it into a data in Polyapp. And both situations require you to set up this API call and to test it with this test button under configure API call. And there are these mappings which let you map from your happy, easy to read, like word to translate type fields, and then map them into things that the API will understand, like the word translate, because it might not like, say, spaces. Or you might just have some really long field name and you want to map from there to there with a really long field name. Or somebody's used to it being called, counter 5, and they want it to be called counter 5 in Polyapp, but the API recognizes it as 5 counter. It doesn't really matter. The point is that you can translate between what somebody sees in Polyapp and what the external API sees by adding these mappings from the field name to the external field name. And those mappings are applied in the request URL, they are applied in the request body, and when the response comes in, those mappings are used to take the JSON responses values and then map those into data for Polyapp's fields. Now, if you're using an ingress bot, which takes data from the external API and puts it into Polyapp, then this response mapping really matters. If you're using an egress bot, the response mapping is not going to matter at all because we're not going to store data for an egress bot from the response, because we're basically just expecting a 200 OK response from the external API. If you want to do both ingress and egress from the external API, a great example of that is this example I'm showing you, because we are calling both the ingress bot ID and the egress bot ID. From the external API's perspective, this is probably pretty strange because it means that we're calling the API twice, whereas if you wrote your own code, you'd only have to call it once. But this is just the way that Polyapp is set up, and we try to separate those two different concerns from each other. All right, that was a lot of information again. I hope this made sense. If you do have any questions, the best source of truth is going to be the documentation site, which is available at polyappopensource.gitlab.io/polyappdocs. And you can go into advanced and you can look at API integration. And this is a somewhat easy to read guide on how I created this example API, and sort of talks about the different fields in the API call task, how you need to test the API call, how you need to integrate this API call task into your target task by populating the bot static data field and by populating one of these fields which will actually trigger the bot. All right, and again, if you have any questions, you can always email us at support@polyapp.tech.